Hello and welcome to Datum. This is season 2, episode 6, and today is a Byte, and we're talking about the data side hustle. Ravi, how are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm fresh off watching Game of Thrones, so I am medium. That is
You're
my
medium.
reaction.
Medium. Okay.
That is
It's
my
not.
pop culture reaction for today.
It's not been a great season, I hear.
I mean, it's basically been like this the soundtrack and the cinematography, and if you're a film buff and you quite enjoy the sort of angles and all that stuff, it's been great. Like the soundtrack, the score, the sort of effects, and like where the
Right.
camera's been, and some of the shots have been incredible. But yeah, the storyline just seems rushed. I think everyone's just. I think at the start of the season, I was speaking to some people. I was like, honestly, I just want it to finish and be like, there we go, done.
And there was a Starbucks cup and a water
Of
bottle,
course.
apparently. Yeah. So two very unenvironmentally friendly references in the Middle Ages or wherever Game of Thrones is set.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So yeah, no, we're back. We're back on the grind after what I'd say is a sort of a short break. We're hot off the heels. I don't think we're hot off the heels, but yeah, we're following up from the last episode on behavioral design, which we sort
Yeah.
of quietly released along with our new branding and our new
Yeah.
style.
Yeah, exactly. I think the switch over to the new brand, and then we just didn't really push this episode so hard. So those of you that did listen, thank you. It was we didn't get much feedback on it. I think that was in lieu of the quieter release of this one.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I think the content we covered in that was good fun. Like we had a few tangent rants and things like that, but it was good overall. Overall, I think we covered a lot of ground in that episode. I think that's definitely one we definitely mentioned to come back to in about 6 months' time and sort of see what's changed, especially with our
Yeah.
opinions.
Exactly. I think we did it as a bit as well because I think it needed that sort of precursor episode to sort of take you through
Yeah,
the
the theory.
technicalities of it. And then when we come back to it as a bite, it'll be a very different topic where we'll be talking
Right.
about the thing. So think of it as part one. It's definitely not something that we're done with. We'll come back to it.
Completely.
Today we're talking about the data side hustle. What's a data
Right.
side hustle, Ravi?
I think so. This is your term, right? This is your term
Right,
for
right.
the hobbyism and the things we do on the side to develop either our own skills or just a sort of a pet passion project to follow along with, right? So,
Absolutely.
for you, I think that's quantified self, right? Like that's
It
your
is indeed.
thing.
It is indeed, yeah. I've had a very quiet few, actually, I'm going to say years with that.
Mhm.
I haven't put much
Very
out
much
into
so.
sort of the open sphere compared to I think 3 or 4 years ago when I was pretty hard on it in the public sense. And yours is football, right?
Correct. Yes, football analytics was always my route into the world of data and Tableau and who I am today in a weird way, right? Because it's
Okay.
this addiction I had to Football Manager or Championship Manager, the game, which then translated into like a moment of, oh god, I can do this for a living, and there is a faction of the sporting industry that can benefit from data. So that's definitely my passion project, and it's something I don't do as much as I used to. I used to blog semi-actively on a personal side blog of mine. A lot of my Twitter followers are from those days,
All right.
and it's sort of tied down a bit. But then I still produce some visualizations, in my opinion, a bit better than I used to, which is
Okay.
quite fun to see when you scroll down to the bottom of my Tableau public profile.
Yeah, no, it's good to see sort of your progression as you go on. We'll actually come onto this specifically later on. I have to say, you mentioned something about Football Manager. I don't know many people who play that game who aren't addicted.
Yeah.
For reference, Football Managers, it's like a football simulation, or for the Americans, a soccer simulation game, right?
Yeah.
Where you don't actually play the game like in FIFA,
No.
but you just simulate the progression through a season, right?
Yeah. It's just got more and more layers to it as you go on. Like you can play it as a really simple player, where you just assign the best players, set them up in a formation, then let them play and win all the games. But then you've got like you set your own challenges. Like I want to build a dynasty or build a team that has average age of 25, and you're doing all the facet things of it within a team. You're doing the sort of financial management, the training.
Right.
You're then winning cup. Well, it's just good fun. You're getting sacked and fired and all this stuff. I think even they've even got Brexit in the game, right? So Brexit Day comes in, and then you can't sign foreign players.
Wow. It sounds
so
like a
they've-
side hustle in itself.
completely. There's so many people that have like they've got it on their CVs, like taking Forest Green Rovers from the National League to the Champions League in 7 years, for
Wow.
example. But that's a
Wow.
lot of time investment.
Okay. And it's funny, just coming back to this sort of idea of a side hustle. I think we both have these side hustles. Because I think we're passionate about them. But
Mhm.
also I think it's because we have a sort of an inherent interest in this area. So you've sort of talked a bit about Championship Manager. Is it Championship Manager? Have I got
It's
that right?
Football Manager now.
Football Manager now. Okay, great. You've talked about Football Manager, and for me, quantified self is really started when we had things like Fitbits coming to play. I kind
Right.
of when Fitbits came out, I envisioned this world where you'd walk around with a sort of health device on your wrist, and I was
Mhm.
always fascinated about the data that you could sort of get from these devices. And it's taken a while to get to where we are today with Apple Watches that can do ECG readings off your wrist.
Mhm.
But what's been fascinating is that I discovered this world of people who are doing way more interesting analysis than just step counting,
Mhm.
using data, some of it probably mostly manually collected. But it's been a really interesting kind of subject because it's involved a lot of technical skills and soft skills. So that's sort of what drew me into quantified stuff. I was getting familiar with data. I found
Mhm.
this hobby that was data oriented, and at the same time, I was seeing sort of different soft sides to data. I was seeing the kind of psychological effects of monitoring yourself and
Yeah.
improving the quality of your life.
No, that's really interesting because like, in terms of being drawn into football analytics, it was always Moneyball as the concept, but then the
Right.
second you started figuring out and looking at the data that actually was collected from football matches by companies like Opta and all these other data providers,
Hmm.
you realize that the granularity was so important, and then you sort of start thinking about like, hang on, can I spot players that people aren't knowing about? Can I start looking at team styles? Can I see patterns that you might not be able to see because you're watching one match? And there's always the anecdotes about scouts going to watch players.
Right.
You're going to watch a single player, and during a 90-minute match, you'll basically focus on that one player and what they're doing. Whereas data then allows you to watch 100,000 players at one time and just
Mhm.
set KPIs to saying if they're hitting this consistently, then we look up and listen and start looking at the video behind that. So.
Exactly, and but there's something to be said about sort of the aggregate nature of that, right? So
Mhm.
you find people who are on paper technically good, but actually when you go see them, there's a
Mhm.
softer side to the finesse of the way they do it that, as a
Correct.
scout, I think gives you an edge over sort of the big data approach, right? It's not
Yeah.
just that they're making those tackles and scoring those goals; it's the way they're doing it that maybe leads you to believe that they can do it at a higher standard in a more sort of competitive play.
So you mentioned you're sort of starting with Fitbit,
Yeah.
and going from there. Like I remember we had a conversation recently where you were like, "Oh man, step count, that's so bushly. That's old school stuff. No one looks at step count anymore." Have you seen that development, like how you understand and look at wearables, or
Yeah, so it's interesting because wearables themselves are trying to do more as well. So
right?
there's this big push at the moment to do with well-being and healthy mind and
Yeah,
kind of
mindfulness.
exactly. And the only thing that these devices can really do is remind you to do them and sort of nudge you to kind of do them more often. But in real terms, the technology hasn't really developed to a really sort of advanced state. I think if you take an Apple Watch or a Fitbit, at their heart, they're just doing what they did, 3 years ago. They're doing it doing it a lot better at more increasing levels of granularity, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the other thing is accuracy as well. So whereas the step counter 3 years ago was a guesstimate, today's step counter are a little bit more nuanced. They can detect things like swimming, running, cycling, and so on and so forth. So they can more accurately detect activities that you're up to. But the classic example I always give is that let's say you took your Apple Watch off and
Hmm.
you left it in a drawer for a day, and
Hmm.
then the next day you put it back on. It would probably nudge you and say, "Hey, yesterday was a really unproductive day.
Yeah.
Do you want to do stuff today?" It has no awareness of the fact that you weren't wearing it. The prompts they give you kind of punish you. Like the classic one is, 10 o'clock, you get a notification from your Apple Watch saying, "Stand up." Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
or go for a short brisk walk. It's this kind of like, hey, you're not doing what I've been programmed to tell you to do. Do you want to do it right now? And
Yeah.
there's no context to say, hey, you know what, I'm sitting on the sofa. Maybe now isn't the right time, but the next time I get up, maybe that's when you should notify me and tell me to go on a brisk walk or do something because
Yeah.
that's probably a better time, right? On a sofa, I'm not going to get up, so
I,
I'm not that
I,
smart.
I always find it funny when you're sat in a room with Apple Watch users and it's like 10 to the next hour, and everyone sort of looks
Yeah.
at their watch.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. It's like everyone's part of the same sort of machine, and
yeah.
there's not really much sort of customization. But we sort of digress. I think going back to sort of the value I found from it is that kind of tackling these soft questions and understanding how the data doesn't necessarily tell the full picture. Now, that's something I've really found valuable in my professional life. And it's something that I learned purely through QS. I learned it quite simply because what I did is one of my sort of things I do all the time is track my music. So since 2009, I'm coming up to a decade. Actually.
Last FM?
Exactly. In July, I'll have a decade's worth of music listening history available to me through a service called Last FM. And about 3 years ago, I did a very basic viz. I joined up all the dots. This was back before Tableau was really kind of, as big as it is now, I guess. And I used Alteryx to bring the data together. I could probably use Tableau Prep for that now. And what was interesting when... I hope so.
I don't think you connect to the API through that.
I can't connect to the API, but I could use it to sort of connect the data sets together, which is predominantly what I'm doing. So gotcha. I'm downloading lots of different data sets from different services in Alteryx. And then once I have them, I have what's essentially like a music metadata library. So each track has its own metadata. And I'm basically just joining that data onto my music listening trends over time and then visualizing it in Tableau. I'll
tell you one of my big bugbears with just a lot of QS data in general. Well, I think this just goes back to when I had my Fitbit. I had HR. So my main two motivators for buying a Fitbit was, first of all, I wanted to track my heart rate and step count, and third of all, I wanted to do sleep. Now, when I had a Fitbit, I have an Apple Watch now, but when I had my Fitbit, it was like notoriously difficult to get your super granular second by second data out. Like
Never
it's disgustingly. No, exactly, and it's like, I'm buying this wearable, I'm tracking my data, I want to know at the lowest level of granularity what I can get, but I can't even see like how many steps I did in a minute. I can't go down to granular and bring it back up. The only thing I can do is look at the Fitbit dashboards. And I think this is where, going back to your earlier point about the data collection and the development of wearables, one of the big things I've seen personally is they're slowly getting better at visualizing this data, right? I think Apple do this quite well. I think I've seen a few people who have criticized the use of rings, but I think the rings work well because you're not looking at that granular number. You're looking at whether you're hitting your target. And completion to goal is like, am I at that completion to goal? Am I at the 100% yet? And you can see that with the ring. That's fine. But when you look at the actual vizzes behind it, you can actually find out whether or not it's able to pick out those visualizations. So yeah, if you look at the actual app itself, the chart, the bar charts, and whatever the distance to go on, giving you that overview of the last 7 days, etc., they're actually pretty good, I think. And that's getting better as well, alongside the granularity of data. I think you've actually pulled some of the Apple data out using Alteryx, right?
I have. And so this comes down to philosophy, right? So Fitbit, they don't really have much. They don't have an ecosystem to lock you into. So that's one of the reasons they're not prepared to just easily give you the intraday data. Intraday data is minute by minute blow of what's happening on these trackers. They actually do collect it at that level, but what they do is they aggregate it up to the minute, because if you think about it from a second point of view, the databases would be humongous. Yeah, absolutely. So they aggregate it to the minute and they store it away. And in the apps, you see kind of readouts based on the minute by minute blow. But in reality, when you export it, I think the easiest form to get is a day by day blow. Now, What's interesting about the Apple ecosystem is that because it uses a privacy first model, I think it's actually one of the best systems, because essentially what happens is your device is the database. And when I exported data from Apple Health, it collects data at the most granular level that the device that's tracking that information collects it at. So if I think about my phone will count things like steps as granular as every second. So it will say, okay, for this second, Tim did this many steps. Okay. I use a heart rate monitor that's capable of recording multiple readings per second. Again, the heart rate monitor will record to Apple Health at multiple readings per second. But something else might only do it per minute. So there's no sort of specified level of aggregation in Apple Health. Because of that, my Apple Health library is about 3.5 gigabytes when I export it, and it comes out as a JSON readout. So it's a good thing that this is synced to iCloud, because it means across devices you can kind of carry it on. But it's an enormous wealth of information, and most of the stuff on there is heart rate readings, because my Apple Watch has been tracking that, and then I also do a lot of sports, and my chest track has been tracking that. So this is something that's getting better and better over time, going back to my earlier point about accuracy and fidelity. Depending on the platform you choose, they have various reasons to give you as much granular information as they can, and at least in Apple's sense, and also to an extent Google as well, they're actually pretty good at giving you access to the raw data, because what they're providing is a platform that other apps can hook into. And in order to do that, you need to kind of be as open as you possibly can. Now, the downside is that this stuff is on your device. It's actually incredibly hard to get it out of your device unless you know what you're doing. And like any sort of, I've always criticized exports from services. They're never that useful because they come in formats that the everyday person
just the wrong format.
Has no clue what to do with, like XML, JSON, CSV. You might be able to do that, but then you get ridiculously sized CSVs, like a gig and a half that you can't pass in Excel or something.
So this is a really nice segue. I think this is a nice segue back into football analytics. So one of the reasons I picked up on this as a side hustle is, so providers like Opta and more recently got Prozone and StatsBomb. Well, Prozone is now Stats as a company. So all of these companies do collect all this data. So for example, if you look at TrackAd, which is tracking data of a player, which is using multiple cameras around a stadium, and they're looking at the number on the back of a player's shirt and mapping it back to the database. That's taking data at every point 0.025 of a second. So it's like every quarter of a second it's taking. So you get 4 data points per second. And it's funny when you and that comes in a format which is .dat and an XML, and then you get Opta data, the F24, or which is the event level data. They've got a new one which is event plus a few other metrics. That comes in XML format. So if you think about the people that work in analysis at clubs, until more recently, it's generally been sports scientists, right? So people that have done physiology, they've done sports science, but they've never really been people that use computers. Like, yes, they've done coding because as part of sports science, they do some coding on matches, similar to how Opta did it, where they tag events and clip videos together to say, okay, here's where we had a good shot, a fast attack, here are the key events in a game. So when you're playing back a 90-minute match to your teammates or the players or the staff, they will just quickly see what's going on. Now, when I started working with the public data, it was aggregated because Opta are selling this as a business. Like it's a couple of multiple thousands of pounds to buy the access to the data, either by API or exports or whatever you want. They're able to service that. And one of the most interesting things we found was like, well, these people who work in clubs, yes, they have the idea, they have the grounding in the game, they understand the technical aspects, but they're not really data people.
Right.
I've been going to the Opta Pro Forum now. I think this was my 3rd or 4th one this year. And it's fascinating to see like the amount of statistical analysis that goes on. People using R and Python, and they're combining all these events together and finding patterns and telling stories with the data sets. But what they're fundamentally no one ever talks about is the back end.
Yeah.
Like, how are you passing the data? How are you bringing all these things together? What is the function? What's the best way to show this back to a coach or a player to get them to get that insight? And this is the sort of the ground that I find myself in, like increasing thinking, like building that platform. The clubs that I've worked with or I know of, there's only a few doing it in the right way, where they've got a database, they've got a data processing platform that they're doing in-house. It's not a secondary company. And then they're also doing some bespoke things on the front end. The club's doing that few and far between. But I think that is changing, given that that the game is changing, right?
Exactly. And just going back now to a high level, like it's funny because our side hustles have actually given us this sort of unique ability to take this data, and it's allowed us to sort of dig into this discussion. So from your perspective, I think that's one of the things you bring to the Opta forum when you go there, because you actually critique the back end systems. Because a lot of people buy the data but don't necessarily, they have the data and they're in Excel. They're kind of working it hard and working it the hard way. And in contrast, by doing what you've done, you've actually been able to go and critique this process.
Exactly, and that's exactly my overarching point. It's like this, the sort of grounding where it was just sort of an interest, and now I can I feel I can speak a bit more intelligently, not just about the data and how to pass it and the issues that are within it, but also saying, well, what happens if you go beyond counting stats? What happens before you go beyond saying we took 7 shots in this match? Like, when did you take them? What was the game state? Were you 2 goals up or 1 goal down? Like, how is the team impacted by those things? And then with the tracking data, it's fascinating because this is such granular data. And if you think about football as a sport or soccer as a sport, it's a game of spaces. And when you start being able to quantify those spaces and detect patterns and spot things that players do or teams do, or, and then tag that to events, that's when you start getting really insightful stuff. And that's what's exciting for me, at least. When you start bringing those things together and getting that insight in, you can start having those really interesting conversations with coaches on a level that they understand and they can see. Beyond just like when people generally get at tracking data, all they do is plot the X and the Y's and watch the games, but with scatter plots, basically, which defeats the object in some way.
Right, exactly. And I think that's one of the things I think side hustles do is because you're more passionate about the subject. Let's take football analytics.
Yeah.
You're naturally football about analytics. You're naturally passionate about football analytics here.
Yeah.
And so that passion actually drives you to a deeper level of understanding within that area, maybe more so than, let's say, some of the sort of the drier stuff we do on our day-to-day work, with clients or with our own businesses, right? Because I think your own business can kind of suffer from this. Several issues. First of all, access. You don't get as much access to data internally sometimes because of governance and bureaucracy. And so when you have ideas, it's really hard to run with them because you have to make sure you've got everything in place, right?
Yeah.
You just want to prove the value of something by experimenting and innovating, but that you don't necessarily get that in business. Now, the other thing is that it naturally develops your skills to be able to communicate the challenges you're having. I think one of the first things I learned when I was working with quantified self-data was that bringing these things together wasn't a simple thing. Like, I had to really understand that if I was going to make my music data and my moves location data work well together, I had to understand at a very granular level, what I was doing in each minute. So I built out this minute level data set, and then I was able to say, okay, in this minute I was generally here and this is what I was listening to, and then I was able to sort of map those two onto each other and go from there. And it's a really, really important thing to start to understand. And having that passion allows you to ask deeper and deeper and deeper questions to the point where you realize that actually there is no end to what you can ask. There is no end to how you can interrogate something. And then when you apply that back to your everyday, you suddenly realize there's so much more you can do with your everyday data.
Agreed. And I think you mentioned this earlier when you were looking at your quantified self-data through Alteryx.
Yeah.
It sort of exposed you to the download tool and things like this. And I think that definitely harks back to something I've done. So when I started using Alteryx, I learned so much about things like the detour tool, like control parameters, like having basically the painful things when you're trying to combine and pivot and parse XML from a really ugly thing and try and create this repeatable process, which is a macro that does it what it works. I think this was like one of my train projects. So I have an hour-ish commute. I'd spend an hour in the morning just like tinkering with this sort of thing and getting it as far as possible, and basically ended up with this working prototype until I got to a match where it was 0-0. So basically, I had one of my passers saying, if there's a goal, pass it out. But then if it was a 0-0, there were no goals and there were no assists. So basically, it was like, well, I can't pass this match. So I had to create exactly. So I had to do a detour tool to be like, is there a goal? Is there an assist? And then if not, do a detour to go like this way or this way. And it's like so many of those small nuances about working with data, I was able to work out through a passion. Like if I was working with, I don't know, website visitor data and trying to figure out how to pass that, I would have been asleep and I would have moved on really quickly. Like I would have basically got it working and left it. I wouldn't have tried to make this really perfect, efficient macro that does it automatically. I wouldn't have thought about it in such a way where I'm like, I really want to get this done because of X, Y, and Z. And then finally, I think your point on wanting to do better because it's a pet passion and trying to drive the other people around you further. That's definitely something I've done. Like I remember, I think I mentioned my crusade on long and wide scatter plots.
Right. Okay.
That would never have happened if I wasn't like getting angry at people posting wide scatter plots on Twitter. Right. Like I would never have written that, and I wouldn't have thought I need to educate these people about why it's wrong, because 3 years ago I probably would have done the same. But now I'm a bit more educated and a bit more formalizing data viz best practice and the reasons behind doing things. I feel I'm in a place to educate that back to people.
And that's the thing. And it's funny because that in itself is another skill that you pick out of it. So you learn, actually you kind of become humbled by the experience, right?
Correct.
You go in, I think you go in with this sense of confidence when you're passionate about something.
Yeah.
I know everything about football, I know everything about quantified stuff, I've got a Fitbit,
Yeah.
and as you go into it, you slowly start to realize, oh wait, I can't just export this data. And you go, then you someone tells you, oh, there's an API, and you go, okay, API, I wasn't expecting to have to do this way. And you start working with it, and it humbles you. It kind of shows you, it kind of teaches you to give these challenges the right level of respect, and that in itself is portrayed by the way you then communicate it to people. You treat the topic with respect, and therefore you're more encompassing about bringing people into your sort of your skill or your fold, and kind of making them understand the challenges that you go through.
Completely. And I think that's definitely fueled my recent change in tone has been about a lot about actually it does matter a lot about who the player is, like what they're doing and all this stuff. Like you can't just purely base something on statistics or numbers. You can't just say one of my favorite players, Cole Skews, is the most pivotal player in the team. Like you can see that without him in the team in Ipswich, the team are a lot worse off. But also you got to take into account his fitness data, which we don't have access to. You don't see him in training. You don't see his attitude. You don't see how he changes and the things he brings to the team. Like all of these different things you can't really quantify. It's a lot harder to quantify, and that's what a coach brings to the table. Again, going back to our day-to-day, we go into companies and we try and solve their problems with limited to no knowledge of the field. We don't have that depth of knowledge at a company. Yeah. And I think those pet passions, these data side hustles, really help you to realize you're not an expert in those things. And, you're really, what you're doing with these things is continuing your learning based on something you're passionate about and seeing what else you can pick up along the way.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think that's one thing. I remember an experience where I presented to the London Quantified Staff London group. The first time I presented, I really didn't know what to expect. So I just did a classic talk about music, and I talked a lot about Ultrix. I kind of felt like I was selling Tableau and Ultrix at the time because I was a year into my journey, so I was trying to kind of showcase that a little bit. And I, the first few questions I got, the first question just knocked me off the floor, and someone just asked me so why are you doing this? And at the time I was in my head, I was because it's cool, okay?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
like I know what I've been listening to for the last 8 years. That's cool. And in my head I could hear myself saying, no, that's not the right response, Tim. Come on. Why are you doing this? and what I realized is, okay, so why do I think it's cool? So I drilled into that question in my head, and I just started talking out loud here. I was okay, so why do I think this is cool? Then I explained, listen, you have this idea of listening to music, and there's a really simple thing I always say. You ask someone, what do you listen to? And they come back with 2 or 3 artists, okay? In reality, you listen to a plethora of artists. You're not the sum total of 2 artists, 2 or 3 artists. And the exact opposite, someone goes, oh, I'm really eclectic, right? And more often than not, when someone says that, and I'm able to look at their data on something like Last.fm, they're actually not that eclectic. There's a hidden secret between what they listen to. And I'm only able to see this through the attributes of the individual tracks that they listen to. To actually arrive and say, no, you're not eclectic at all. You happen to listen to all these songs, but here's the thing they have in common. They're all acoustic, they'll have the same level of energy, and all these attributes are measured by other companies. But I'm actually able to sort of draw the commonalities between what they think is eclectic and what is actually the same. So what you've described as eclectic is actually one thing. It's not eclectic at all. And so just having that discussion out in public was the cool thing. And I'd realized, yes, okay, that is actually why I do it. Understanding underneath the skin what's going on.
Yep. And I think the quantified selves is really interesting, intersection of, you sort of sit there and be yeah, but why am I doing this? It's funny, everyone's yeah, but why are you collecting all this fitness data?
About yourself, yeah.
Exactly. And it's well, in some ways it's changing my behaviors, because you start looking at these things and you're oh, I did less than last week, or you start doing these, you compete with yourself and others. But also I think that one of the key things you mentioned that's really interesting is the patterns between people. And the insights you can find with that, and that then goes back to if you're able to do this within an organization, you're saying, right, we're not going to look at X, Y, and Z. We actually only care about this week what you're doing outside of work, right?
Yeah.
Let's focus on that, and then I want you all to come back to use the tools that you're using at your workplace and show me something interesting. Okay.
Exactly.
And it's like almost like this 5-10% time, right, or 5% time, whatever you might call it, where you're able to give back to someone, and because inherently you're giving someone time back to develop something which is relevant, and you're saying use these tools, because you're using the tools that you'd use every day anyway, it would just end up being like a benefit in kind. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but in a month's time, you're like, oh, I worked on that because I had to change this data set from this ugly thing to something else. And then I visualized it like this. Maybe I can use a similar visual to portray this finance data when we're trying to compare 7 different products.
Right. And that's one of the, also one of the sort of unique aspects about it is that I always called quantified self as digital narcissists, because
that's totally what you guys are.
It is exactly that, but I hate the term narcissist because it sounds so negative.
Yeah.
But it's funny because, like, why wouldn't you take an interest in who you are and what makes you, right? And understand that, because at a high level, you have you think you know what's going on around you. Like, you think you know what you did yesterday in incredible amounts of detail, but actually you're very transient. Humans are very transient beings. We focus about the now and the future. Although we like to think we reflect on the past, we don't actually keep that much in the past, apart from painful experiences. That's what we carry forward. And so the good stuff just kind of blows on by. And so just having this understanding of how you work and the transition, I think, is really interesting. And I think in a business context, this is absolutely the same skill that you need to have, but you're applying it not to yourself, but to your own business. And so it's the same sort of inquisitive nature that you'd apply to yourself. If you apply it to your business and you create a culture where people can do the same thing, then people start asking really fascinating questions about the way you do things, rather than just assuming that that's the way they're done.
The questions will always get better, right? I think Tom, our boss, always talks about this concept of if you ask one question a day publicly out loud, no matter how difficult or not so difficult it might be, your questions inherently just get better and better, right? And I think that holds true with quantified self. It even holds true with football analytics. The more you dig into this stuff, the more you find out. I think one of the big like topics these days is all about automation, right? And automation is a funny one because with quantified self, you always talk about active and passive, right?
Right.
And I think for the last 6 months, I've been using an app called Reporter. And in the last, I'd say 2 or 3 weeks, so Reporter is this app done by a guy called, created by Nicholas Feltron, who had these incredible reports about himself, basically. He did a yearly report about his year based on data and infographics. And one of the tools he used to do this was an app called Reporter. Now, I started off using this quite enthusiastically. Like, oh, yeah, this is going to be great. Like, I'm going to have a month. A month. And then I'm just like, whenever I get a ping, so it picks 6 random times throughout the day, I'm just like, oh.
Fatigue,
I'm just like, do I need to go through? I'm now just like sporadically. And I'm just going to basically think about this in a year's time and say, right, let's look at the frequency of reports. And also, let's also look at the fact that the thing that I'm now trying to get out of it is, when am I reporting? And also, why exactly? When am I sending these reports myself? And then comparing that to the passive data collection that I have, right? Like steps, my heart rate, all like, I don't know, Twitter history. When am I tweeting? All of this stuff. And combining all that together, I think would be more interesting. But I think active v passive is a really interesting conversation as well. Yeah, especially with quantified self.
And again, in business, I'll reiterate this again. It's, the reason I always harp on about passive collection. So active and passive, what Ravi's talking about, is essentially this philosophy in quantified self, which I think, I don't know if I came up with it, but I think I read it from somewhere. And the idea is that active is when you're physically collecting the data yourself. So you're getting a ping on your phone, you're filling out a form, and then you're storing the data somewhere. Passive is where you're not having to do that. Something is doing it for you in the background. So for me, when I listen to music, I don't have to log that somewhere. There's a service called Last.fm which is doing it for me.
Let's do a scrubble.
Exactly. I've set up another passive way of tracking when I'm at home and not. And the way I do that is I have a Wi-Fi router that's hooked into if this then that, and so every time my phone or my watch or my laptop connects to the network, it logs it. And so I have a pretty accurate reference for when I'm at home and when I'm not at home, just based on when my devices connect to the network, because I'm never at home without one of those 3 devices, right? So that's a very good active and passive way, rather than me saying, oh, hello Foursquare, okay, Swarm, okay, let me check it.
Or even Amazon dash button, be like, I'm home, let me press this button.
let me press this button. Right, exactly. It's like the thing about this Wi-Fi collection is that yes, it might over-report when I'm at home because I might leave my phone at home and go out to the shops very quickly, but my watch will disconnect and connect. So I've got such a good level of accuracy there in aggregate compared to me manually maybe forgetting one or two times. And so the quality of the analysis I then get from that is much higher. Same with location tracking. I don't do that myself. I have an app that does it. And it doesn't have to tell me exactly where I am, but it just needs to capture the general trend. And when you have that quality of data, it's much, much richer. Now, the thing where, passive can't work is with feelings and emotions, because
Correct.
going back to what you're talking about when you track, when you do active forms of tracking, it tends to work better for when you're trying to measure sort of your mental health or
Correct,
well-being, or things that are, things that trigger, and therefore you think, let me monitor this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And over time, when you become fatigued, what you end up doing is only recording the more negative aspects. So if you're sort of tracking your mood and you have to log it manually, what ends up happening is you only ever log it when you're unhappy, because you want to make sure you've got that as a reference point. But you don't like stop in the middle of, I don't know, roller coaster ride to say, let me log this while I'm going up and down this, this trough ride. This feels great, but you're not pulling out your phone and logging it straight away. In fact, you're just enjoying yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So active passing tends to suffer from this sort of very negative skew where you capture more about the bad stuff than the good stuff, because the good stuff, well, why would you monitor?
So I'm actually having a quick look at my reporter, and it's honestly like, so when am I reporting? I'm reporting when I'm watching TV, traveling, texting, or chatting.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
Mostly when I'm at home. What else am I like? Yeah. And my because there's also like, you can turn it off when you sleep and you wake up, so you've got questions to ask when you wake up about your quality of sleep, and also when you go to sleep about your day in general and your feelings towards it. And again, that's so sporadic. I have so few data points on that, because it's like, before you go to bed, am I going to press that button? Probably not, because I'm doing other stuff.
Yeah.
Like I'm busy, or I'm just like flat out and I've just gone to sleep.
Exactly.
Exactly. But yeah, I think your point on when you do it, I think that's really interesting, because it's definitely something people use in mental health, like to track behaviors and how you feel, just so psychiatrists and psychologists have that information to go back to, saying like, okay, cool, so when I'm around Tim, I'm always feeling really depressed, right, for example.
Nice.
And that sort of feeling and tracking, just to help people be more aware of their emotions, it does help.
Yeah, exactly. And so if I take this back to sort of a business context, where this has really helped me is that, whenever I'm talking to clients about the way they collect their data and how they bring it in, I'm always leaning towards the more passive systems, because I inherently know that for the things that they're trying to track, apart from the qualitative stuff, like this is actually the more valuable side of things. So like, if you can just spend a little bit more time getting out of your form culture and into your sort of sort of automatic data collection, and just have systems that collect data on behalf of people. So they're more likely to input when they need to, because they know that quality of data isn't going to be there inherently in a good way. And you're also taking a cognitive load off the user for having to remember to do a whole bunch of other stuff. So I find it easy to track my mood, because I don't have to track all these other things. I have to think about 35 different things that I could track passively. And those are 35 things I don't have to manually track. And that makes it so much easier to track one simple thing, like say my diet when I'm eating or something, because there's still no good way of tracking food automatically. I think the best way I found is MyFitnessPal barcode scanning. So it has a really good barcode database, so you can scan something you're eating and it will grab the calorie data off its own database and input it to health for you, which is great. But I still have to do the manual task of opening my camera apps, scanning the barcode. And I'm hoping this is one of those features that Apple Sherlock and then just built it into the camera app, so that you can just take a picture of a barcode and it tell you all the nutritional information about the food without you having to open another app. Genuinely, that would be a life-changing feature for so many people, honestly. But anyway, I digress. These principles carry through to the business, and it's so valuable when people do that, because it also brings a different what is it? What's the word I'm looking for? Ethos. No, subject areas, different subject areas. People who think differently, who are creative in a different way, end up interacting with your data in these awesome ways, and they borrow concepts. I borrow concepts from quantified stuff all the time. They've got nothing to do with most of the client stuff I work with, but the chart types, the ways of manipulating data, dealing with sort of obscure things, and like you say, coming across edge cases and realizing that when you build systems, you have to test these edge cases thoroughly, right?
Yeah.
You can't just build something, hey, it looks great, and then as soon as you have a 0-0 game, Ravid realizes,
yeah, I mean, a perfect example was my World Cup dashboard, right? That was a lot of manual data collection, but once we got to the second round, and my thing where players come on and off the team sort of structure, I didn't factor into extra time, so it's like taking left 2 of the numbers, like 90th minute, that's all they're going to be, and then suddenly you've got a player coming off in the 12th minute. It's like, hang on a second, there definitely was injury, but it was because it was 120th minute. Oh man. Just rookie errors all around.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it's funny. It's funny how that all kind of plays out, and I think it's a really valuable thing. I guess the now the so what is that we've touched a bit already, but actually enabling people to have these things, and hackathons is such a good way of doing that, right?
Yeah, agreed. Like running a hackathon internally, even if it's within your own data. So I've sort of seen this in 2 different places, right? So you can either have a hackathon in internal data where you're saying, right, okay, the incentive is you get to present this back to the C-suite or senior management and show your ideas and what you can do. Or I've also seen this as like, here's a theme, here's some data, tell us something interesting, use these tools, right? And that both work in their own sort of way. The first one probably takes a bit more like coaching on the tools. The second one is a bit more fun and perhaps gets a bit more engagement. But at the end of the day, it's about giving employees time and sort of saying, this is interesting, this matters to us. We really do want to have our employees work on this sort of thing. Exactly.
And also, I think in terms of how else do you support these people to do these things, like it sort of goes without saying, we have access to incredible software that does all this stuff. And part of that is being able to actually, take my copy of Tableau or Alteryx and be able to do what professionals do with the data, but to do it with this hobby. And it's a really important thing that to recognize that people like Tableau, they actually enable you to do that through things like Tableau Public. So take advantage of free software and training courses, and let people go on that one-day training course that might not sound like it's got anything relevant to do with your everyday business work, but actually the skills they'll learn, they'll pick up, will give them a passion in data and also data literacy. Like you're fundamentally talking about building people's literacy levels, everything we're talking about, whether it's reading or writing, as we talked about before, right? And so just investing in people's literacy alone in this sense really, really helps give back to your business as well.
Exactly.
Cool.
That's a good episode.
It's been a good episode. I think we indulged a bit. We came a bit off track. We went into our passions, but it's all worth the while. Hopefully, just to try and highlight how valuable we think it is, to our own development, also how it can be to others. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode. Please keep the feedback coming in. As a reminder, we've changed our name and branding. So we're at datumpodcast.com and we're on Datum Pod on Twitter. So much, much easier to find. No whatnots anymore. I keep digging that because I'm so glad every time I have to say this now. I'm just like, it's so much better.
Agreed. So much easier. It rolls off the tongue a lot more.
Yeah, exactly. And as ever, we rarely ask for support in this way, but if you can give us a rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to, that would help, because apparently that's becoming the currency for the podcast wars that are going to be coming up in the future. So platforms are going to start kind of siphoning off podcasts to lots of different places. So yeah, if you can rate us, that would really help us as well. So we know what we're doing and we can improve and make sure we're getting to the right places. Cool.
Fantastic. Cheers, everyone. Have a good one.
Take it easy.